Hi, everybody. So welcome to week 13 and welcome back from your spring break. I hope that you took some downtime for yourself and maybe slept in a little bit or took a nap or went on a hike or did something that was enjoyable for you. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to run through chapter 14, which is stress, lifestyle, and health. And then I'm going to run over the forum, the discussion forum for this week. And then we'll see where things end. If you need to get in touch with me, you know where to find me. So when we're talking about stress lifestyle, we're talking about really talking about stress for sure and how it impacts our lifestyle and how it impacts our health. So it's really difficult to concretely define stress. So it's often conceptualized as something that's demanding or a threatening situation. In such cases, the definition is more stimulus-based and characterized by reaction. So stress can be also described as a response based in a physiological reactions. So regardless, stress encompasses the perception of overwhelm or threat to the individual's well-being, which are caused by stressors. So stress is a term used loosely to describe a variety of unpleasant feelings, such as frustration, anger, conflict, overwhelm, or possibly fatigue. So when we're talking about stimulus-based definition, we look at perhaps a high stress job. Stress is demanding or threatening in an event or in a particular situation. So a stimulus-based definition characterizes stress as a stimulus that causes certain reactions. So this fails to recognize that people differ in how they view and react to challenging situations. So when we're talking about response-based definition, we're looking at the emphasis on a physiological response that occur in response to a demanding or threatening situation. So stress can evoke a variety of responses, including physiological, which is our heart rate increases. We may have headaches, or we may have gastrointestinal problems. Cognitive would be that I may be having a difficult time making a decision. I have a really hard time focusing and concentrating. Behavioral, what we see happening is that, drinking alcohol or smoking or taking an action that is trying to eliminate a type of stress, whichever causing the stress, yet we don't see that it actually is beneficial. So when we're approached with a stressful situation, there's two types of appraisals we use to assess the stressors. And we're talking about how within our mind, how cognitively we look at a situation. So we have a primary response, a primary appraisal. So it judges the degree of danger and we're in harm. So what's the threat? The threat could lead to harm, loss, or negative consequences. And the challenge is, it can carry the potential for a personal gain. It can help us perhaps grow. And when we're looking at the secondary appraisal, we're looking at the ability to cope or respond. How do we, within our mind, how do we actually find a way to cope with the stressful situation or without having a negative consequence? And even if we're coping, we can change that threat and put it into with whatever way we cope into a personal growth. It can be a gain for us. So when we're talking about going to school, there's lots of stresses, and we don't necessarily see harm, or we may see a loss in a grade. We may have a negative consequence that we end up having to drop a class. Yet even within that, we can have some potential gain, some personal growth, and recognizing perhaps I took too many classes. Maybe I was overwhelmed. Perhaps I'm working full time and I'm, have children and I'm in a relationship and I'm just overwhelmed. And so what needs to go? How can I learn to cope with that, so that that threat doesn't seem to be such a stress that we can't overcome it? So when we're looking at this fight or flight response, we look at the early contributions on the study of stress. So Walter Cannon in the early 20th century, he was the first to identify the body's physiological reactions to stress. So he first named it fight or flight response, which he suggested is a built-in mechanism. This is simply what we have. It's biological, innate. And that he looked at how how we stabilize this fight or flight response and for our survival. So in the past, it was really about, if there's we're hunters and gatherers and there's an animal coming, what do we do? Do we stay and fight, or do we actually flight because we have no ability to fight it? So fight or flight response is a set of physiological reactions that occur. So when an individual encounters a perceived threat, the physiological reaction produces activation. It works with our sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. So this arousal prepares a person to either fight or flight from a perceived threat. In a sense, an adaptive response, which has helped the species to survive. And you see here, our pupils dilate, our heart rate increases, our muscles tense, which really is just getting ready to run if we have to. So general adaptation system came across by Haynes Seeley. And it's really this non-specific physiological response to stress. So, what he found was that whatever situation, which is a form of a threat, there is this physiological reaction within bodies. And so what he noticed in rats, when he did his studies with rats, he noticed that a prolonged exposure to stress caused the rats to show certain signs. So, adrenaline enlargement, the thymus and the lymph nodes were shrinking, and the stomach ulcerated. The same pattern of physiologic reactions occurred regardless of what the stressor was. It didn't matter if it was something that was fear of death, or it simply was not having food. These were the things that they were starting to see. So in his stages, he saw that in the first stage, or the first, in a sense, the first being was this alarm reaction that the bodies immediately reacted. Immediately upon facing a threatening situation or an emergency, there was a physiological reaction that provoked energy to manage the situation. So when we move to the stage of resistance, you can see where we start to do an incline, and it seems pretty heavy here. So it's the body's readjustment stage, in the sense that the stressor, keeps us in an alert and in a preparation to respond, but it's not as intense. And what starts to happen is that after, if we stay in the stage, there's a lessening of, the shock of the reaction has lessened due to the adapting to a particular stressor. So when we're in school, all of a sudden we have all of these papers due, we have midterms, we have projects due, we have perhaps you have to do a presentation. It's all of these things are building, but we've learned during this phase to actually lessen our reaction, because we've learned to, in a sense, adapt to it, so we don't see a lot of the physiological reactions showing up. So then we step into the stage of exhaustion, and this occurs when we're in a state of a stressor, a stage of an exhaustion, when the stressor is maybe no longer possible, but we exhaust ourselves. We don't have the energy to adapt. There's a depletion of the physical resources. So the physical wear takes a toll on the body's tissues and organs, and this may result in illness, disease, or death. And so an example would be, you're coming to the end and you didn't, during your resistance, you didn't really adjust, and you exhaust yourself and you get sick, say, because you weren't coping well within that time. And so what we tend to see is that during this resistance phase or stage, we do, in a sense, learn to cope, and then that level of stress diminishes because it doesn't seem so overwhelming. But if we are continually in this stage of stress and it doesn't stop and we haven't learned to really cope, then we exhaust the body. So there are different kinds of stressors. Stress is a normal feeling. And so there's two types of stress. So acute stress, it's a short-term stress, and that goes away quickly. So you feel it when you slam on your brakes in your car, say. Perhaps you have a fight with your partner, you're skiing down a slope, and that adrenaline is there. In a sense, it's helping you to manage dangerous situations. It occurs when you do something new or something exciting. So all people have acute stress at one time or another. During this time, we see what's called a beneficial stress, and it's called eustress. And so, it's a form of motivation or a positive drive with a particular situation. So you're skiing down the slope, there's lots of stress within that, yet you have, you're motivated to do it, and there's a positive outcome. A marriage, preparing for a wedding. Again, this is a eustress. Stress, it's over and done, and that stress goes away. So when we talk about chronic stress, this stress is a stress that lasts for a long period of time. You may have chronic stress if you are having money problems, if you're in an unhappy marriage, if you're having trouble at work. So any type of stress that goes on for weeks or months would be considered a chronic stress. So you can become so used to this chronic stress that you don't realize it's a problem. And if you don't find ways to manage that stress, it may lead to health problems. So, and again, if you're not coping, and this is what we're, really what we're looking at. So we all know we have stresses in our life. So how do we bring it down to the point that we're, coping with it at a healthy level? So we have distress when we're looking at chronic stress, and that's when there's a shift in the positive effect to a negative, that it becomes excessive or becomes debilitating. So there's different categories of stress, and one category of stress would be considered traumatic event. So exposure to military combat, a threatened or an actual physical assault, physical attack, sexual assault, child abuse, robbery, terrorist attack, natural disasters, car accidents. So stressors of this type can cause people to develop PTSD. And so, we also have another stress. We're looking at life changes. And some fairly typical life events, such as moving, can be actually a significant stressor. So even if we have a plan to move, if it was an intentional, it was going to a positive side, so we're moving because we're going to get a better job, that doesn't mean that first you have that stress of moving, but then you also have that stress of adjusting within that job, adjusting into a new community. So what psychiatrists looked at life changes, simple things that happen with our life that we maybe not have any control, or if we have control, is something that's intentional. So Thomas Holmes and Richard Ray created a social readjustment rating scale. And what the scale is, and you'll see it later, is the scale that you can add up points determining, what causes more stress, and it kind of identifies how much stress you have in your life. And if you recognize that you have all this stress, you need to look at it. What is it that I can do to, again, adjust or cope my ability, to, manage that stress in a sense. So in a way, or in a sense, the social readjustment rating scale was detailing the extent of the effect and stressors, as well as the level of a person's adjustments need to cope. So they used it with their clients, and they were saying, okay, we're identifying that you have these three main stresses on the top part of the chart. What is it within those three that you can make a shift from? What can you do to change that so that you can actually, at a personal level, learn to make those adjustments? It also was intended to look at the amount of stress that we're carrying, because we tend to carry so much stress that we don't recognize that it's such a heavy load and that we may need some help. And at that time, when we're looking at, how well am I coping with it, we have to decide, what can I do about it? We don't just let the stress come. We want to come back to a place of homeostasis. We want to come back to a bit of balance. So daily hassles, those minor irritations, these are everyday things. So maybe standing in the line at the bursar's office at college. One of these stressors can lead to negative and distressed mood states. So I'm irritated. It can build up and leave us feeling very stressed out. There's a frequency of daily hassles. Is really a good predictor of physical and physiological health that change our life. If we can't even adapt to these minor stresses in our life, we need to look at the bigger picture. What is really coming into play? So when we look at other stressors, we look at job strain, the work situation that combines excessive job demands, perhaps overloaded with little discretion and decision making, or perhaps it's our job control. And so the job strain is associated with increased risk of physical problems. And I think what's really interesting to see is that we don't recognize how, we're starting to see it more and more, but we don't necessarily, even as a student, a first-year student, we don't recognize the amount of stresses we put on ourselves. So, close relationships is a big one. And what tends to happen in some relationship is one person is going to school and the other person feels threatened by them going to school. And then you have, conflict. You have that stress. The stress of having to figure out what you're going to do with your children, the stress of how you're going to be able to pay all of your bills and how are you going to be able to work. And it may be that you can't work full time. So you have to find another financial means to support yourself while you're in school. So when we're looking at the psychophysiological disorders, we're looking at the impact of stress. So we start to see chronic stress and its sustained physiological reactions can lead to wear and tear on the body. So sustained high blood pressure can lead to a heart attack or heart failure. Continuous exposure to the cortisol can weaken the immune system, putting a person at risk for infection or disease. So again, when we're at this place of stress, chronic stress, we're putting stressors on all parts of the body that we wouldn't even think. So a weakened immune system, high blood pressure, fertility problems, rapid breathing, asthma comes into play. And I think what's really amazing is we don't recognize that stress has, impacted the body as much as it does. So common examples include tension headaches, asthma, acne, eczema, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, coronary heart disease. So what this chapter is really trying to focus on is, okay, we all know we have stresses. How well am I coping with these stresses? And is this stress and my inability to cope with that stress causing me to have a sense of hopelessness? So we look at elements of happiness. So happiness is this enduring state of subjective well-being. What do I consider my well-being in a place of happiness or in place of joy? And where do I find my contentment? And, so positive psychology looked at, so we understand stress. So how can we, and we understand happiness, but how can we turn this around so that even during a crisis or even during our stresses, we have a sense of meaning and purpose and value within our life? And if we're not feeling this, what are we going to do about it? What needs to go? Where do we find this this functionability within this stress. So factors that influence happiness, age, our life satisfaction, will usually increase with age. Supposedly, and they've seen these studies, but who knows if it's, because we're living in a different world, and how our social relationships impact our happiness. Are our social relationships actually causing more conflict? Is there a person within our life that is always negative, and we need to remove them from our lives because we're not having a high quality social relationship with this person? Money, again, is, wealthy individuals tend to be happier than poor individuals. I tend to disagree with that, because I know people who are poor, and it's not even necessarily being poor. It's really how you look at the value of money and what you think that money is giving you. If you don't have the money, are you still happy? Can you survive on simplicity? Religion, spirituality, again, comes into play, because we tend to see people who have a stronger commitment to a higher authority, in a sense, feeling like, there is a higher purpose within our life. And culture plays a big role on, our happiness, in the sense of, within a culture, some cultures have this tendency to spend time with their family on a Sunday, and that is that connection. That's connection with the family. That's connection with a culture. They value togetherness. And we have, and a culture can be even in an environment that you share something. So I would even say that a culture stems into a religious culture, that there's this respect, and there's friendship, and there's affection within that. So what I want you to do this week with I'm going to pop it up. I'm going to share my, there it is. I want you to look at, and specifically talking to college students. If you're all starting in, first year of school, what I'm wanting you to do is that you've experienced stress so far this term. And it can be anywhere from not getting a good grade, or being confused about, how to work D12, or how is it that I have to start a new job during this term, and how are my children doing and coping, and my partner's coping with me in school, and giving them less time, and really focusing on myself. So I want you to look at the stressors you have in your life, and you can, even if you want to, you can identify one particular stress. And I want you to find coping mechanisms for this. I want you to find a way to adapt within the stress. So I want you to go onto the web and find some web-based, particularly for college students. And you may not be able to, but try to focus on college students and stress. And how are you going to cope with that stress? And I want you to do a summation of this particular link. So on this page, you're going to look at, the name of the site, who is the intended audience, again, what's the purpose of it, how new is this information, and did anybody leave anything negative on this this website? Did you have any negative reviews? And why would you suggest this website? Why do you think this is a hopeful website? Because I want you to be able to use this as you move through your schooling, your academic career, because you're going to come with the same stressors. But if you can learn to adjust them now and learn to cope with them now, then your success in your academic world is actually going to be much higher. And it could be simply that you need to do some time management. And so this is what I'm wanting you to look at. Make sure you put the link on there. So again, do the summation, and then tell us why you think this is a good, a helpful website, because I want you to share this information with your peers in this class. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say. I want to, we have 3 weeks left. I think we can get through it. I'm going to shift a little bit in the discussion forum for week 14 and 15. I'm going to have you do an assignment instead. I want the discussion board to be left on a happy note, so do something positive for your peers. And I'm wanting, I'll go into what I want you to do for chapter 14 and 15 and this assignment next week. It is going to help you prepare for the final test, because chapter 14 and 15 are pretty thick. So we're going to try to, lessen the stress on you. Okay. If you need to get in touch with me, email me and I'll get back to you. I wanted you guys to make sure that you still understand that I don't necessarily, emails come to me through the Georgia Highlands website. D2L don't get to me as quickly. So just understand that sometimes it takes a little bit longer for them to get to me. It just is what it is. So if there's anything else that you need from me or want to talk to me about, let me know. And I look forward to this week and getting close to the end of term. I know we're all looking forward to that and having some time off. Okay.